You remember Elie Mystal. He sort of looks like a grown-up Fat Albert, but with a shock bouffant of white afro hair. He sort of looks like a Q-tip that's been x-rayed or something. I'm not sure. But Elie Mystal, forgetting his appearance, his physical appearance, which is the least objectionable thing about him, Elie Mystal is a raging, race-baiting racist. And he says extraordinarily volatile, divisive, hateful, and, by the way, idiotic things. So therefore, he is a media favorite on MSNBC, CNN, and his latest appearance, of course, on The View. He is outrageous. He is hateful. He is bigoted. He is divisive. And so legacy media likes to have him on as much as possible. He's selling a book, and here's what he had to say about, he's also a lawyer, by the way. So here's what he had to say about the laws in America, about our criminal justice system.
One of my premises for the book is that every law passed before the 1965 Voting Rights Act should be presumptively unconstitutional, right? Because before the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we were functionally an apartheid country. Yeah. Not everybody who lived here could vote here. So why should I give about some law that some old white man passed in the 1920s, like the Immigration and Nationality Act, when they passed our...
All right, so there's the premise of his book. And of course, you saw all the ladies on The View. Yes, that's right. Of course, every law before the Civil Rights Act should be considered unconstitutional. Oh, that's so smart, because we were an apartheid country. Well, an apartheid country, by the way, in our recent history, there has been an actual apartheid country. It was South Africa. And they called their racial segregation in that country and discrimination apartheid. So it is literally the apartheid country. Prior to South Africa, I don't know what you would call an apartheid country, because you didn't have apartheid. That said, let's look at South Africa for a moment. In South Africa, every single black person in that country had fewer rights and less representation and less constitutional rights than a non-black person in that country. That is not what the United States of America was prior to the civil rights laws. I know that he would like you to think that. But actually, black people in this country, first of all, constitutionally had every single right. The problem was there were some states who had segregation, who had discrimination, who had bigotry built into their laws. And it took the Civil Rights Act and the constitutional test of that act to eliminate those laws. But if you were a black person in, say, Maine or Vermont or Illinois, you were not treated the same way as you were in, say, Alabama, right? So by definition, the country wasn't an apartheid state. There were some states that had some laws that resembled apartheid laws in South Africa, but even that is overstating the case. But you know what? Let's take his premise for a second. Let's take his premise and dissect it a bit.
My premises for the book is that every law passed before the 1965 Voting Rights Act should be presumptively unconstitutional.
So every law prior to 1965 should be presumed unconstitutional. Remember that word, unconstitutional, okay?
Right? Because before the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we were functionally an apartheid country. Yeah. Not everybody who lived here could vote here. So why should I give about some law that some old white man passed in the 1920s?
Aha. Okay, so again, taking his words, taking his premise, because he's smart. Every single law prior to the 1965 Voting Rights Act should be considered unconstitutional, because why should he care what some old white dude said and wrote into law in the 1920s? All right. Now, to determine if a law is unconstitutional, ultimately, you would have to take it through the court system and hold it up against the language of the United States Constitution, right? That's what you do to determine something is unconstitutional. It's funny. He thinks that laws written before the Civil Rights Act should be deemed unconstitutional because that Civil Rights Act in some way changed things in the Constitution. But of course, the Civil Rights Act is not a constitutional amendment, is it? So even after the 1965 Civil Rights Act, which is a law, it's an act, it's not a constitutional amendment. every law post Civil Rights Act that is tested against the Constitution is actually being tested against the exact same document that every law prior to the Civil Rights Act was tested against. It's the same document. The Constitution didn't change after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So right there, it's sort of nonsense. It doesn't make any sense at all. But then there's one other thing here. What was the last thing he said about those laws written prior to 1965?
Should I give about some law that some old white man passed in the 1920s?
Right. Because some old white man in the 1920s wrote those laws and they don't stand up to the pristine nature of the Constitution. Do we want to reveal to Elie Mystal who wrote the Constitution? Does he know? Should we share with him? Who wants to tell him? You think it was some old white dude in the 20s? Dude, I assure you, black people had more to say about how laws were written in the 20s than they did during the Constitution. You think it was white dudes writing laws in the 20s? You don't get much whiter than the Constitutional Convention. Does he think that the Madison and Hamilton that wrote the Constitution are the same dudes who are doing the hip hop musical on Broadway right now? Because I assure you, Elie, they were not. Elie Mystal wants to deem a law unconstitutional prior to the Civil Rights Act. Meanwhile, the actual Constitution was written by old white dudes. Although, given his logic, he'd probably have an opportunity to throw out the Constitution too. The man is not serious. The man is not wise. None of his arguments hold up to logic or history. But I want to remind you that the legacy media love him because he makes you mad, because it affirms their preconceived bigotry. He's everything they've ever wanted in a political analyst. Because here he is again on MSNBC, of course, because they love him.
About their status. And just to slightly push back on Mark, even if you tell me that, and you prove that they're gang members, I'm not so sure that I'm okay with them being sent off to be tortured in a foreign country, but I'll leave that aside. Fundamental.
So, of course, this is a conversation that we had yesterday about the members of Tren de Aragua and MS-13 who have been deemed terrorists by the commander-in-chief of this nation, utilizing his powers as commander-in-chief in directing our national security and foreign policy, saying these people are a terrorist organization. They're in the country illegally. They can be sent home without any due process whatsoever. In fact, the law states that it's an immigration judge that determines whether they can be deported or not. And in the case of the gang member terrorists who were sent to El Salvador, they're Venezuelan nationals. They were sent to El Salvador because their own country didn't want them back because they knew how badass they were. And here's Elie Mystal saying, even if you can prove they are who they say are, even if you can prove they've got, by the way, it's been proven because our law enforcement is allowed to make that judgment. Again, that's what happens when you're at war with a terrorist organization. You make that call. But Elie Mystal, the brilliant civil rights lawyer, the man that the left loves to platform and promote on their channels, on their legacy media networks, he says, even if they are terrorists, I don't think we should send them out of our country. We should keep them here. The terrorists who came here illegally, where was the due process when they entered our country? You know, we have a process there too, don't we? They came into our country illegally. They stayed in our country illegally. They wreaked havoc here illegally. They continue to be criminals. And Elie Mystal says, yep, keep them here. Keep them here. And we are very much looking forward to Mr. Q-Tip's next mainstream media appearance. Maybe it'll be on George Stephanopoulos' show. We'll be there for it. We can't wait.